Hello, everybody. Welcome to Quantum Witch Cafe. Today, I have the honor of hosting Jeff Kripal. He's an amazing author. And if you don't know who he is, I will have him introduce himself in a minute here. But first off, thank you to anybody listening on YouTube or Anomalous Podcast Network. Please leave some reviews, follow, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I also have Jeff's info in the description. So if you're looking for his website and stuff on him, it'll be there. But welcome to Quantum Witch Cafe, Jeff. Today, I'm very excited to have you. I created this space to discuss anything paranormal, strange, fringe, UFO, UAP, if you're fancy, So when you reached back out to me after I emailed you, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is like the perfect person for this channel because you know all that stuff. So thank you again for joining me this early morning. I see Kat in the chat. She's amazing. So thank you, Kat, for showing up so early. And Jeff. So give us your bio for those people that might be listening that don't know who you are. Please tell us who you are, what's your motivation, and why are you doing what you do?
Yeah, so by training, I'm what we call a historian of religions. I compare religions, or I compare religious systems. And I'm really interested in religious experiences, particularly of the extreme sort. So out of body experiences, near death experiences, UFO encounters, that kind of thing. I'm an academic. I mean, I'm a professor. I'm the guy or the woman in your college classroom asking you to read a lot of stuff. I'm a bibliophile. I love books. I think books are magical, literally magical. In my day job, I work as a university administrator. I'm an associate dean at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And I'm trying very hard to essentially mainstream or integrate anomalous phenomena into the humanities, in particular in the universities and colleges. That's really what I'm up to, Priscilla. That's really what motivates me. It's really an intellectual, professional project. But I also am like super, super interested in public cultures and the way that these ideas are talked about in the public, or more likely not talked about. And so I'm really interested in podcasts, and I was really interested in your show when you showed it to me first. So I think this is the way to do this, is to talk to as many people as one can and try to expand and integrate the conversation in as broadly a fashion as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for saying that. And also, yes, we've had a lot of things coming out in the open. It's not complete like disclosure like people want. Like people want to know what's the afterlife. People want to know, are ghosts real? People want to know, are UFOs here? People want to know, who are the occupants? And that but there's a whole other camp of people that are in shock that our government's even speaking of unidentified, anomalous phenomena. So I think that we've made like a big jump just in the past couple of years, honestly, in talking about stuff like this. Because when I was little, I'm 38, so I was in Catholic school when I saw my first UFO. I tried to tell people. I got sent to the principal's office. Like, it was not spoken of. And don't you dare mention that, maybe in Ezekiel there's a UFO. It's just people are finally coming out of that, but some parts of the world are still very what is the word I'm looking for, conservative maybe. But yes, I think that your work is great. And I had a teacher in University of Alaska where I studied molecular biology at, and I almost switched to her humanities because religion has always like fascinated me. And I always would joke like, oh, like if I think that I can make money in studying religion, I would. And then I meet you and Diana this year, and or make a living, not like try to be, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't know that there was a job like this, in all honesty, because I was the first one to go to like university on my side, so I didn't really know what was out there.
Well, yeah, I'm from Nebraska, Priscilla, and generally the public is completely unaware that you can study religion in a way that isn't particularly religious, but also isn't particularly debunking. It's a really interesting middle space where you can explore practically anything. But it's unknown.
Yeah.
Nobody, as I say, nobody grows up wanting to be a professor of religion. That would
Right.
that would be one weird kid. They're probably out there. Some of your
I
listeners
was
are
gonna say,
probably right.
yeah.
And say, well, I did. I'm like, yeah, you're weird. But that's
Yeah.
the thing.
I mean, from the second I could read, I had my grandma's encyclopedia, and I looked up religion and would research every religion under religion. So I think secretly I was not. I mean, people knew I was weird. Like people used to call me Wednesday Adams at Catholic school. So I was definitely one of those weirdos. But but it's great that you're bringing this out and trying to bring it to universities, because a lot more people are interested than will talk about it because of the stigma. It's okay to talk about biblical stuff, right? Like people are comfortable with that. They're comfortable with the mysteries in the Bible. No, they're not.
They're comfortable talking about the Bible in traditional biblical terms. They're not terribly welcome or warm about discussing the biblical text the way a scholar of religion or a biblical critic might. So I think the relationship between these phenomena and the religions is fascinating, Priscilla, and I think it's really important. The religions are generally not super friendly to these phenomena, and yet they all use them, for their own ends or their own goals. So it's complicated. It's not an up or down kind of thing. It's a both and.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense, and I've often thought that myself, but I don't. It's not necessarily something I really have to feel bold that day to bring it up on the playground with the other moms. And then normally they're like, "Rrr," like the part of the movie where the record stops and the music stops and it
Yeah.
makes that sound. I swear I hear that in my head like so many times a day. And then my husband's supportive, but I talk to him and he gets like that, like he goes to his happy place look.
He glazes over. I
Yes,
mean,
yeah.
it's the same in a college or university. Trust me, it's just like, and it's
Yep.
all over. So you got to find ways. That's what I do, is I try to find ways to talk to people who otherwise wouldn't listen.
Yes, and that's the whole reason behind, me creating this podcast, because I got tired. I didn't know anybody in UFO land. I wasn't a cool kid, so I'd see these panels of, like, predominantly men, and I was like, "I'm never gonna get in there," because they've talked to all these famous people. I'm just like, I didn't finish my degree. I'm not using my degree. I don't have any letters with me. I don't have any certificates. I have a Reiki certificate. So, but I've studied energy work, but that doesn't necessarily sit well with nuts and bolts UFO researchers at times. So I created the podcast in hopes to interview any author that would say yes on anything strange. So, but
Well, I hope you keep speaking out, and I hope you talk to those mothers on the playground, and I hope you sit on those panels, Priscilla.
thank
That's what
you.
we need.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm starting to get a good panel with the UFP book club that I started. So every month we pick a book that's related to the UFO UAP phenomenon, or I would say phenomena because it's so much more than just one thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm getting some people in there, so it's progressing, and it's kind of like my time. People talk about self care, like shopping, all this other stuff. Like this is my outlet, because in my heart I'm an academic. Like I would study forever if I could. And you talk about, oh, I'm that teacher that gives you the books. Like I was that nerd that loved the books. So
Right, you were the one of the 3 people in the classroom who actually who wanted to learn.
exactly. And also I'm older too. Like, so when I was in college, I started at 30. So, well, I started at 26 and I had to spread it out because of working. So I think that I was older. I'd had like the fun hairdressing career and, service industry, and I was serious when I went. So, but I
Yeah.
wanted to, oh, I'm
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
sorry. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I was just
I
gonna say
went,
I'm s
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just gonna say, there's this saying that education's wasted on the young, and, there's some truth to that. I mean, the truth is that our culture only allows for this 4-year gap between 18 and 22 generally, but adults who come back to school, particularly around philosophical questions or religious questions, they're actually, way more interesting as a teacher, frankly, because they have questions and they don't believe they're immortal anymore. I mean, at 18,
Yeah.
you think you're immortal, and
Yeah. You just go do stupid things.
Well, and you should. That's great. That's great. You're 18. You should do that. The old hormones are surging. But, you know, by the time you've experienced some life, you realize things are not so simple.
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about your paranormal experiences. You had mentioned an amazing experience that you had in India, when you went for one of the goddess, celebrations. Did you I don't know if you were there for that or if you were there during that time. Are you comfortable talking about that experience?
Well, I've I've written about it so many times.
Yeah. I
So
still ask, you know, like,
yeah,
sometimes people
I
aren't in the
can't talk
mood, so
about it. It's pretty pathetic, actually. Yeah, so
it's
that
not
was
pathetic, stop, because then the more people need to talk about their experiences the way that you have, and I know you have, but
yeah,
I always ask because, like I said, some people don't wanna revisit that day or they're not like I said, there's some people just aren't in the mood to do it, you know, at times.
yeah, yeah. So that event. So first of all, I don't experience myself as particularly gifted in this area. I describe myself as a spiritual dud, and I'm sincere about that. I think I'm pretty thick, um, and I've been around people who are just wired differently. They're open to these other worlds and these other experiences, and I'm just not that. However, I've had enough of these experiences to make me deeply sympathetic. And so when someone tells me about an NDE or an abduction event, I'm like, yeah, I get that. Um, so the one overwhelming experience I had was in Calcutta, actually, in 1989. It was in early November. It was during a festival called Kali Puja, which happens right around our own Halloween, and I think which most Americans would see as very Halloweenish. I mean, you have cut off heads and severed arms and cremation grounds, and I mean the whole. I mean, it makes our Halloween look tame. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Uh, and it's really cool. It's really cool. It's really beautiful too. There are all these what are called pandals that are put all through the city, and the goddess Kali and standing on her husband Shiva is reproduced thousands and thousands of times in really gorgeous, gorgeous temporary art forms, statues essentially, or murtis as they call them. So I was there studying um, Bengali, which is the language spoken in that part of India. I was doing my PhD at the University of Chicago. I was studying a tantric or Shakta form of Hinduism. So I was in the midst. It was a year long. It was a year, an academic year. Was spending there, and I got very ill actually in October, which often happens. And I was probably recovering from that, but I was also attending all of these pandals or festivals in the city. And I went to bed, and sometime early in the morning, I woke up, but my body didn't wake up. It was my mind woke up, but my body was essentially paralyzed. And I felt this incredible energy. You talked about Reiki. I mean, this is sort of Reiki times 1,000. I thought I was being electrocuted. I mean, it was so powerful. It was so overwhelming. It was also extremely erotic in a ways that probably shouldn't talk about. But it wasn't like another dream, or it had this palpable electric quality to it, and it started doing things to me. Uh, and it had its own agency. It had its own intention. I, again, personally thought I was dying. I may have been actually. I talked to a cardiologist a few years ago, and he described a kind of cardiac event I was likely having. I was like, yeah, that actually sounds correct. But the experience was this incredible conscious energy that then imploded into my heart region. And when it did, I had this experience of leaving my body and floating to the ceiling, and then eventually getting back into my body. I had to crawl back into my body from above it, and then I woke up and I could move my body again, and I felt like there was this incredible kind of download was not a metaphor we had in 1989, by the way. It didn't exist. But, to speak anachronistically, it felt very much like a download. And I wrote my first book really out of that experience, a book called Kali's Child. And I've been kind of writing out of that experience ever since. Because I know that a lot of scholars who write about these things have had these experiences, and they're really trying to understand their own experiences, even when they're talking about someone else's. And so that's what I do now, Priscilla. I talk to people who have had similar kinds of weird experiences, and I try to take them seriously. I don't take them literally, by the way, nor do I take mine literally. But I think we mistake, or we do them injustice, frankly, when we interpret them literally. I think their images and their events are meaningful, but I don't think they're literally the case. So that's that's that third space I'm talking about. But that's really what opened me up to this. It wasn't until years later. I didn't really get interested in this intellectually until about 15 years ago. I was writing a book on the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, and what's called the Human Potential Movement. And I started to talk to all kinds of people in that movement who told me really strange things. And I recognized all of these strange things from the religions I knew, but I had been trained to think that that all of this was kind of legendary or was exaggerated to accrue power or authority or something. And I realized that these people were telling me the truth, and that these things really happen. They happen today. And so I became really curious and a bit troubled by why intellectuals like myself don't listen to them and don't take them seriously and kind of dismiss them. And that's why I wrote Authors of the Impossible, by the way, was to try to understand how my own intellectual traditions had suppressed these things, even though in the late 19th and early 20th century, people like me were fascinated by these things and were writing. And they actually made up all the words we use to this day. All the words we use, psychical, paranormal, psi, parapsychological, those were all coined by nerds like myself. None of those appeared in tabloids or in the popular press before they were coined. They all were coined in the universities.
Yes, that's very cool, and a lot of people do have experiences like that that you don't necessarily get to tell other people about, because you had mentioned a couple of things that, like the electric feeling. I've tried to describe that to people, like almost like one of those muscle stimulators was on my whole body, and the whole you mentioned like the erotic feelings that people are kind of afraid to talk about here. I don't know what it's like in other places of the world, but
Oh,
here it is, very taboo to mention anything erotic without all these connotations automatically going to it that are put there by, I guess, Western culture.
well,
Um,
no, it's not just Western culture, unfortunately, Priscilla. I mean, any culture, really all cultures that I'm aware of, put the damper about right there and prevent us, I think, from really understanding what's going on.
it's the most human thing, though. That's how we like we're human, like this is how we came into the world, by these feelings happening, these even chemicals, happy
No,
hormones, sexy hormones, whatever you want to call them. It all feeds into like how you were created. It's your creation. So for it to be so bastardized by media and thinking it's only
well,
this two things, like people automatically hear erotic, they think pornography. And I don't think that. And, because I know that there's a deeper experience with it, that can be attained.
well, frankly, this is where the humanities could really do a service. I mean, the Greek word eros really was seldom understood historically in a purely sexual or biological way. The erotic, particularly in Plato, was a means towards achieving divinity. I mean, it's what you harnessed. It's what you rode to the Platonic forms and had visions. So that, human sexuality wasn't just instinctual. It wasn't just biology. It had this kind of metaphysical force to it. And that actually was my early interest, Priscilla. I mean, I was raised Catholic too. I know I know the whole Catholic scene. I wanted to be a monk actually, and I went to a Catholic seminary and I spent 4 years there, and I became fascinated by erotic forms of mysticism or mystical experience. And it turns out that particularly in Catholic Catholic mystical theology, Eros and the experience of God are intimately linked. And men and women have both had erotic experiences of divinity. And I became really fascinated by that. And that's actually what took me to India, was that erotic mystical confluence. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. Of course, you're preaching to the choir.
Yes.
I'm
Well,
already there.
yes. That's why I liked your work too, because you were not afraid to talk about that. At one point, was going to church a lot because I didn't know what else to do. I was kind of like at a, I was in a sinkhole, or kind of a, what is it? I don't even know how to describe it. But I met a friend and I started going to church with them too, because the loving energy was there. Well, I had at one point become very curious about the Holy Spirit. So I started studying the Holy Spirit. And at one point I had gone up during one of the, there was like a nighttime kind of like singles type of church thing happening. And I went up to receive prayer and the anointing. And you know how they say you fell out in the spirit? Well, it fell out in the spirit, and I had that electric sensation, but what I felt too was almost like a whole body orgasm. And I know that sounds a lot of people are like, "Oh God, you said orgasm," like, but it felt like that energy just going through your whole body. And there's no other way to describe it the way that it felt. And that's not something I was able to tell anybody at church, which I obviously left because I was like, I think I'm a witch still. Like I've been back and forth between like witchiness and but I've had beautiful experiences with energies that are associated with Christianity too. So it's hard to say what I am, but you know what I mean. You can't talk about these things at
Well,
church.
yeah, no, a couple things. One is what you learn by reading enough mystical literature is that this sort of orgasm that you're talking about is they're often pansomatic, by which I mean they're not focused in the genitals. It's
Yes.
a kind of full body orgasmic ecstatic state that isn't actually sexual in any kind of
Right.
genital sense, but it's clearly related to one's sexuality and to one's gender and sexual orientation and everything else. So that's really important. The second thing I'll say is, whenever I sit down and talk to an experiencer, I'm always waiting to hear two things. The first thing is I'm waiting to hear about trauma. And there's usually some trauma, some serious trauma in the person's life. It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be sexual, it can be military, by the way, it can be
Yes.
a car accident. I mean, it can be any number of things. And the second thing I'm listening for is sexuality, because a lot of these experiences are suffused with a kind of erotic energy that the person is very aware of, but also embarrassed by.
Yes. Yes.
And I see it certainly as our role to not be embarrassed by those things. That's part of the experience, because we're never going to integrate them into our public culture if we don't talk about them.
Exactly.
They're just going to stay dirty secrets, as it were. And the only reason they're dirty secrets is because we don't talk
Yeah.
about them.
Exactly.
If
Because
we talk
nothing
about,
dirty is happening. I'm
yeah,
not
no,
rolling in mud. I mean, you know
no,
what I mean?
I know, I know what you mean, but they're often hypersexual in really, really dramatic
Oh
ways.
yeah.
Um, and so people just don't know what to do with that. But again, that's part of our cosmic life, I think. And so yeah, my work's filled with those. Actually, if you read some of my earlier stuff, it's nothing but that. that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I thought I laughed when I was reading. I was looking to like make your bio for the description. It's like his controversial work. I'm like, I guess technically it is, but at the same time, I just like roll my eyes because it's part of
Yeah.
I've just always been very, maybe exposed to things I shouldn't have been exposed to at a young age, but that kind of made me view the world differently. And I'm not just talking the UFO stuff. So,
Yeah.
like you said, though, a lot of people have these experiences during key points in their life, right? Just people I've met personally throughout my life, because people seem to come to me with their experiences because they know, even before I had this, personal friends would be like, "Oh, I had this experience last night, and I know you're not gonna think I'm crazy. I had this dream, but it was real, and I had sleep paralysis, but I can't explain it as normal sleep paralysis," you know? So, but they've all kind of been in a transition in their life when they
Yeah.
have it, whether it be, usually, like you said, it's trauma or it's processing. They go back, they're processing a trauma that happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting when you mentioned that, because it does happen, and we've even talked about it in other podcasts. Like, somebody asked me and I didn't make the link. They're like, "Well, was anything going on in your life when you saw those things when you were 5?" And I was like, "Actually, yes, now that you mention it." But I had never made that link, and then after that, I started remembering everything people had come to me with and experiences in my own life and the life of others, that they were in some sort of, I don't wanna say low. They were seeking,
Well,
you know what I mean?
yeah. I mean, so I think of the human person. So I think of you and I think of me as a kind of biological organism that is containing. It's a container, and it contains consciousness or awareness, but actually consciousness or awareness extends far beyond our bodies and far beyond our personalities, and it's everywhere. The universe itself is conscious in this model. And so what trauma does, or what trauma can do, is it can split open that body brain ego container, opens up the container, and other forms of consciousness can essentially rush in. That's a crude metaphor, but it what it does for me is it helps me understand why something really bad, trauma, can result in something really good. And so if you take the near death experience,
Mhm.
okay? You don't get a near death experience unless you fucking almost die.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's traumatic by
Oh, yeah.
definition, by definition. And
Yes.
that's really important because you're being, I think, in the heart attack or the surgery or the car accident or whatever it is, you're being split open, and you're realizing that who you are or what this awareness is much bigger than just the body brain that it happens to be localized in at the moment.
Yes, absolutely, and I mean, I think when you're a spiritual person, you kind of know this without having words for it, and when I took a priestessing training, we learned about this thing, and it's exactly what you said, energetic contraction. When a trauma happens, that your energy kind of either expands out, and then it almost like I always see, like, in my head when this happens to people, because when people are talking to me, I get, like, I don't wanna say visions and make it sound weird, but I get visions in my head, like, of, they're symbolic type of visions, and I'm very, like, empathic, so I'm almost like it's almost like they put me into their story, because when people talk about stuff like this, they go back. It's like they travel back in time because they're there. You see the look in their eyes. They're there telling you this. And I had a woman that I met one time at a brunch, and for some reason I just ended up across from her, and I don't even know how it came up. Probably because I'm a weirdo and I bring up weird things. But she ended up telling me how her fiance passed away unexpectedly, and she had an out of body experience. And
Mhm.
she's explaining these feelings that are happening to her, and I was like, "You had, energetic trauma and obviously emotional, mental trauma, but from an energy standpoint, I saw her energy going out, and she like, when it snapped back in almost, she left her body and saw herself crying on the floor." Now that's I've never met anybody that has had, like, out of body experience like that until I met her, and I found it really interesting because of that energy shift that I learned about in priestessing.
Did she participate in the death of her fiance in some way? I mean, was she there or
No.
aware of it? No.
So he was a motorcycle rider and a biker, otherwise known as a biker. So I say things weird, guys. So he went out for a bike ride. The weather was nice, kind of thing. She's like, I don't know, like we have other things to do, kind of thing. He's like, I'm just gonna go for a quick ride, and that's what happened. She got a call like a few hours later, and
I see.
found out that he had passed
Yeah.
very suddenly. So
Well, people do have what's generally called empathic near-death experiences. In other words, they experience the death of a loved one, in extraordinary ways, but they themselves, of course, don't die. They come back and talk about it. So I didn't know if that's what we were talking about. But
yeah, that's interesting too. I just never had met anybody that had. I know people that have had other types of out of body experiences, but that one was really interesting to me because and she felt like he was her soulmate. So the fact that like from an energy thing, like she's telling me like she felt him ripped away. Basically, she got, like so many people do before the phone call, get that feeling. She's like,
yeah,
describing, I
yeah,
just knew something was going to happen. I had this feeling, and then the phone rang, and I knew that it was because of him.
right.
And I don't even know, how do you explain that to somebody? I read about this stuff, and like none of us understand it, even if you study it. And so how do you help somebody through that isn't even, that this sort of stuff's not even on their radar until it happens to them?
Yeah, I mean, so I think extraordinary things happen to people, though, for a reason. And I think often it's to comfort them or to guide them or to provide some meaning to their lives. I don't think they're random. And I mean, we can always choose to ignore these things too, but I think we do that at a real loss.
Yeah, that makes sense. She's told me that you're the first person that I've told this to, and afterwards she was just like, I need to step away, not because I don't like you, but that just all came out of me, and I can't explain it,
Yeah.
and I understood,
Yeah.
understanding, people's from a woo standpoint, energetic field, and all that. So, you also spoke of when you were talking about Whitley Strieber in one of your interviews, and I want to say it was, I have the note here. You were talking to Jeffrey Mishlove about Whitley Strieber, and you said something about him kind of like being a shaman almost. And can you explain to people what a shaman actually is? Because a lot of people think shaman and they think Hollywood, some guy with shells on his neck and drum, by the
Yeah.
fire.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so the category or the word shaman, it actually comes from anthropology, the study of different and many cultures. The word itself, it comes from far northeastern Mongolia, I believe, and it generally refers to a person in a culture who interacts with the other world, um, sometimes through drumming or dance, sometimes through the ingestion of psychoactive plants. But generally, shamans are experts in possession, in out of body travel, helping people heal in their community by working with them on a kind of spiritual level. So it's the sort of the mediator between the other world and the social world in cultures all over the world. And in the word itself, again, is Mongolian, but we now use it to talk about shamans really almost in any indigenous culture that we encounter. People might be familiar with the earlier words witch doctor or medicine man.
Mhm.
These are really bad descriptors of similar kinds of functions in these societies. So shaman is not a negative word at all. It's fairly positive actually in anthropology. What I said about Whitley, whom I know well and I've been around a lot, he's one of these people who's just wired differently. And I describe Whitley often as a shaman in a culture that has no shamans.
Yes.
So if you're in an indigenous culture and it already recognizes shamanic abilities to leave one's body and to interact with the spirit world, then of course you become a shaman, and you are essentially valued as a key member of the community. But in Western secular scientific culture, we don't recognize any of these things. And so when Whitley has these experiences, people just shake their heads or they roll their eyes or they make fun of him because the culture doesn't recognize shamanic realities or shamanic abilities. That's what I meant, Priscilla, when
Yes.
I said
Okay.
that. But he reminds me. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but of course I know many, and trust me. I mean, weird things happen around Whitley on a really regular basis, and if he were in an indigenous culture, he would be the community's shaman. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of people have experiences, whether it be UFO or a spirit visitation or a religious experience with a deity or God, whoever you're working with at the time, I guess, or curious about, or whoever approaches you in some cases. But it's so hard for people, to integrate that into this life right now. And that's one of the reasons I like to have experiencers on. And like you said, with Whitley, there would be a place for him. But here, unless you're in this community, there's not a place for him in everyday life. And that's very troubling to me because more people are having these sorts of experiences and opening up doors to other, what they call paranormal activity.
So one of the it's a metaphor or a parable, but it really is useful here. So in the 17th century France, let's just pick 17th century France. So farmers were constantly telling city dwelling intellectuals that rocks fell from the sky, and they saw them. They saw them fall out of the sky, and they would land in their fields. And I mean, they saw the holes they made and everything. And the city intellectuals, or there wasn't even a word scientist yet, by the way, but they would just make fun of these dumb farmers because, oh my God, stupid farmers. Rocks can't fricking fall out of the sky. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. But it turns out they can. And once we know what this thing called outer space is, and that there's gazillions of big rocks and little rocks, and some of them enter our atmosphere, and guess what? Fall in people's fields or on people's houses.
Oh my gosh.
Suddenly, the meteorite, as it came to be called, was a possible thing. It was a real thing, and of course, it was always happening. But it was considered impossible by the culture. And so people who reported those things were made fun of. It's not the same kind of space we're in now because not everybody can see a ghost or a UFO or have a near-death experience. It's not like a meteor falling out of the sky. But these things are so common and so widely reported that, any kind of honest reader or observer just has to say, well, they happen. I don't know what's going on, but these things clearly happen. And what we need now, Priscilla, I think, is not more strange stories, although those help. I'm a big fan of strange stories, but more strange stories isn't going to get us where we want to go. What we need is a model or a culture that can make sense of those strange stories and say, yes, they're possible. Yes, rocks fall out of the sky. And here's why, So until we get to that place, I think people are going to just keep shaking their heads. And people like Whitley or yourself or myself are going to feel, like we're on the margins of the worldview and not a real part of it.
Yeah. And a lot of people do feel that's a perfect way to put it because we're just a lot of people that have these experiences are observing the world differently after that. And that's the best way I can describe it. I don't think anybody can describe it specifically or to a science yet. But I did ask you.
Priscilla, I don't think science will get us there. I mean, please hear me.
No.
This isn't like a meteorite. We're
No.
not talking about science here, but we're talking about a different worldview that essentially makes these impossible things possible.
Worldview in some ways is so much bigger than science because it requires you to
I hope so.
Not have something in your hands, like physical, it requires everything from you. from us, I should say, for the worldview.
Like, what would be the worldview that would make some sense of your, orgasm experience of the Holy Spirit? I mean, that just makes no sense, in most people's worlds. And so they're just going to be reductive about it, or they're just
Right.
going to be, they're going to roll their eyes. But it happened. Those things happen. So let's develop a worldview in which they can happen, and then someone like yourself will feel more comfortable talking about it.
How do you see that happening? What are steps that we could take as a society to start building this? And I mean, I know society may not be ready. They're more ready to hear about whether or not some celebrity got plastic surgery this week or not. They're not. They're going like they're out. They're still very. I hate to say they. I know I sound like an alien or something, but I feel like most of society and people that I meet that are not in my little community here, um, it's all about like the physical things in reality, in their reality, that they can touch, see, and that sort of thing, like material gain, stuff like that. And you want to talk to people about what they're feeling in their heart or soul and what they actually believe, like in their as a deep level human, not as like a physical human. And they get very uncomfortable with that. So how can we start? How can we start planting these seeds?
Well, I think I mean, I think that's what you're doing here, right? That's what
Yes, but I want your
Well, my answer, I mean, I think we all work from where we're at, Priscilla. And I happen to be an academic. I'm in a university, so I'm going to work there. And I I think we have to build structures and not just people, to put it bluntly. In other words, we have to build institutions and structures that will outlast individuals like yourself or myself. I mean, so take something like parapsychology. Essentially, what's happened with parapsychology in the universities is it's ridden on the backs of very charismatic individuals like J.B. Rhine, and it lasts for a generation, and then that person retires or dies, and the university just sucks the money back and it
Mm.
disappears. What we have to do is create a structure or an institution like a church or a department or an institute or something that will outlast and be able to reproduce itself over many generations. That's essentially what I think we need to do. And when people ask me, again, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm trying to do in a university. But when people ask me, okay, how can we really help, Jeff? My answer is always, and I'm not, don't take this personally, but I'll say we need lots of money.
No, it's
And
true though.
and I mean lots. I don't mean $1,000. I mean $100 million. And we need to seed some kind of broad cultural project, um, that will get traction, and people can't ignore it. Something like the Apollo Moon program or the Human Genome Project, or there are any number of precedents one could point to here that actually did something, and actually we still remember and still make movies about and still talk about. I think that's what we need to do, Priscilla. We need to think really big and on a kind of broad cultural level.
Yes, because it's definitely broad, and we see these in different belief systems around the world and different people around the world. There's all these like similar underlying themes that people spiritually sort
Well,
of believe, I guess.
so let me just say, so religion is one of these human institutions that's figured out we better do this generationally,
Mm,
right? So the religious institutions have figured out a way to take these anomalous phenomena, embed them in a set of beliefs and rituals that then can carry on from generation to generation. The problem, of course, is those religious traditions then end up believing that they have all the goods,
yeah,
and that all the other religious traditions or cultures are wrong. Okay, so that's not going to work anymore. That
yeah,
that worked in our past, but I don't think it's going to work in our future. But we need something like that.
yes.
Um, it's not that we want to be against religion, but we want a different kind of religion or a different kind of spirituality, I think. One that's a lot more flexible and a lot more capacious and a lot more generous and inclusive. So that's my answer. I'm just blabbing now, but
No, it's great. It's because there's not an answer. So I think that the answer,
moment.
it's almost like a brainstorming thing. You have to talk about it, and maybe maybe something will come up that you haven't thought.
Here's another example I can talk about. So years ago, about 10 years ago now, I hosted a 4-year symposium series on the paranormal and popular culture in Big Sur at Esalen. And we invited a number of people from Hollywood or Los Angeles up. Filmmakers, special effects people, comic book people, a lot of individuals. And I asked them point blank, can you make a movie about the paranormal that does not involve people wearing tight spandex, punching each other, or blowing shit up? And, the answer was no. And I was like, why can't you make a movie that is about a real person with real abilities, and you present the paranormal not as a piece of entertainment, but as a fact, as just an aspect of our world? And why do you always have to give people this loophole to jump through of
Right.
this is just entertainment or this is just fiction? Why do you do that? And of course, the answer was money.
Oh, back to money. Yeah, and money makes people mad. It makes people happy, and it's a necessary type of evil, right? Like,
Their argument was, look, we know what works. We know what kind of movie makes
yeah.
money, and we don't know if that kind of movie will make money, so we're not going to do it.
How boring is that, though? Aren't you sick of seeing the same thing over and over and over again on TV? People give me crap about, "Oh, your books are reference books," or "You don't watch this." I'm like, "No, if I'm not learning something, if I'm not learning something, I don't really like it, you know?" Don't get me wrong, I like all the spooky stuff. Like, we watch American Horror Story because it's weird. Like, I love all the weird, but that kind of is stand out a little bit from the other ones. But there's, like, this horror movie formula or this paranormal formula that it seems to, like they said, this plus this equals money. And 1 second, thank you for everybody that joined in the chat, and I will take a couple questions soon if he's okay, if Jeff's okay with that. But go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Well, so I think the paranormal is already a part of our culture. I think film and television have actually done really excellent jobs of mainstreaming it, but it's a kind of halfway house. People can still say, "Oh, that's just entertainment," or "That's just fantasy." We still haven't. You can talk about the paranormal as entertainment, or you can talk about it as bunk, but you can't talk about it as an actual aspect of the human condition or the human experience. So it's not. I'm all for these films and this television, but it's not enough. And I think a lot of times those writers, well, I know this because I talked to some of them, they've had these experiences. They're doing those shows because they know this stuff is real,
Yeah.
but they can't talk about it as real. So they talk about it in the only way they're allowed to, which is in fiction.
Yeah, storytelling, which is also an inherently human thing, right?
Yeah, it's important.
So, before we get to, I see 2 or 3 listener questions, and I know we're getting close on the hour, but I wanted to ask you about how you said people are wired differently. And Gary Nolan did that big study where he's studying the part of the brain that is
Yeah.
different in people. Do you think that there's going to be any link between that? Even he says it's not going to happen in our lifetime, but it's almost like he's starting to break ground on that research where maybe people do have morphological traits that make them more open to these certain types of experiences. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I'm not a neuroscientist. I know Gary. I know that work. I suspect, this is just a guess, that it will play out and that we will find neurological or brain anatomical aspects that are different among experiencers and non-experiencers. What those are, I don't know. I do. I do think brain science or neuroscience is a bit like your cell phone or your smartphone. The danger is imagining that everything on your smartphone is because of your smartphone. It's in forgetting about the Wi-Fi that makes
Yeah.
smartphone work at all. And with some neuroscience, Gary's not one of them, by the way, but with some neuroscientists, I worry that they think it's all about the smartphone and that there's no Wi-Fi.
Right, right.
I do worry about that. But what they're really studying is kind of organic or chemical correlations. They're actually, I doubt very much they're studying causes or mechanisms.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say about all of that.
We need people studying causes in the future. If you're listening, or if you're in school right now for neuroscience, consider adding that into your study because it's controversial. You're not going to have any money for it, but it's
That's,
you know.
that's my point again.
Well, yeah,
Getting
it's true. You do need money. People get mad about when people talk about money. Like, look at you cannot get around the world or in this life without money. And if
particularly
you're an
neuroscience,
academic,
particularly neuroscience, by the way, you're
yeah,
talking
you need,
about hundreds of millions of
yeah,
dollars.
we got to fund all this. Yeah, I was I had an internship at a biology lab or a virology lab in Alaska, and I remember we had to write little we had to request money to do our little experiments, and I only say little because it was, undergrad level, and I was working under an undergrad and a PhD and everything, but like it was one of those things where you had to ask for money to do this science because just the chemicals involved with neuroscience, the equipment involved is just ridiculously, and expensive. And then those are established. And with you talking about measuring like what's causing it or what's causing the Wi-Fi of us, which could be very well something like consciousness, that doesn't exist. So how much money does it cost to develop technologies that have never been developed before?
But notice my metaphor. It doesn't in any way deny the importance of figuring out how your cell phone works.
Right.
All the science can stay the science. It's all really valuable. It just no longer pretends that it's studying the cause of consciousness or the cause of the Wi-Fi. Your cell phone does not produce what the Wi-Fi.
Right. Right.
Sorry, it doesn't. You can throw it against the wall and break it, or like someone gets in a car accident or has a heart attack.
Mhm.
That doesn't say anything about the Wi-Fi. It only says
Right.
the receiver can't receive it anymore.
That's a great analogy. So I'm gonna move to some listener or some watcher questions. I guess they're listening and watching if they're on YouTube right now. But one of Yanni's questions, who's an amazing person by the way, she has a question about the Book of Enoch. She wants to know your thoughts on the Book of Enoch and all three of the books, and she just recently started reading it.
So I have no opinion about the Book of Enoch. I don't know it. I'm not a biblical scholar. I suspect it's apocryphal. In other words,
Yes.
it's scrunched between the Jewish Torah and the Christian New Testament. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means I've never read it and I don't know anything
Right.
about it.
Okay. So James from Engaging the Phenomenon had mentioned that what you went through with your experience in India sounds very much like Kundalini awakening.
Yeah.
And that's more of a comment than it is a question. Do you feel like you can add to that?
So yes, it does, by the way. And that would have been the cultural framework in which I would have understood it in 1989. I think that's just one cultural framework. I think your Holy Spirit orgasm also probably has energetic components.
Mm.
That's another theological framework. That's a Christian
Right.
theological framework. So I think we can kind of jump around and use any number of frameworks to describe these subtle energetic or electromagnetic effects. But I certainly do not privilege one of those over the other. That's the only thing I would say. But yeah, it does. It very much sounds like such a
Yeah.
thing.
And later on, after that experience, when I was reading more deep into I went through I do yoga every day phase, and I'm reading about Eastern religions part of my life after. Well, that happened after my brother passed away. I had like another crazy experience. So this was like after that, but I started reading more into the Eastern philosophies and religions and beliefs. And I realized, wow, that's what that felt like too. So it's
Yeah.
interesting that
I think,
everybody.
listen, we all, regardless of what anybody says, we all share the same biology and the same neurology. So I think different cultures are like, they're playing on the same keyboard,
Yes.
but they're playing different songs.
Yeah.
So some tunes are possible in one culture and not in another, but it's the same keyboard. Um,
Right.
so there's this kind of tough balancing of cultural difference and human universality, as it were.
Yeah, and I try to tell people this, they're like, "So you're a pagan?" I'm like, "Well, no, there's, like, different energy streams that kind of are the same, but we have different names for them."
Yeah.
Like a god named this in one in Greece might be something else in Egypt, but they represent the same, attributes or, archetype if. So that's why I try to tell people, like, it's all of it. It's super weird, but it's all of it. I have one more question, and then we'll start closing up here. I wouldn't want to keep your whole morning. And thank you to everybody who's like, we're drinking coffee and listening to it. I love it. That's like kind of my dream come true because I named it cafe because I'm obsessed with cafes and coffee and deep conversation. So I like the fact that people are listening coffee and or listening to drinking coffee and listening to this. Sorry, I should probably told you at the beginning. I do have ADD, so I like diagnosed. So my brain's like in multiple directions all the time. We have one more question. What do you think the future of comparativism is in light of the increase in scholarship? How can one not get lost in information, especially as we evaluate religious history? Which I think is a good question because so many times we're reading things and you're like, I don't know what to believe or to trust.
So my answer is don't believe. I often say I don't believe in beliefs. I believe in belief. To answer John's question, I think we have to get to a point where we don't feel like we have to read every book and know every tradition. We have to arrive at some kind of model of what the human is that doesn't rely on yet another cultural framework or yet another language or yet another history. And we cannot privilege our own culture or our own language or our own biographical history. I think that's what we generally do. The future of comparativism, I think, is essentially how do we handle human diversity? How do we think about why people are so different? Priscilla, you just invoked paganism. What you were really invoking was a kind of polytheistic comparativism, right? Where
Right.
you compare different deities and different cultures as the same basic archetypes or having the same basic function. That's an ancient polytheistic argument. And what the rise of monotheism did is it made that very difficult to do because
Right.
now you have only one God and there are no other gods. And if you don't believe the right things, then bad things are going to happen to you.
Mm. Yeah.
So I think there's a deeper kind of conflict here between a kind of polytheistic imagination and a monotheistic imagination. And I think the role of someone like myself or someone like John, if I think I do know who John is, by the way, um, is to tease out those implications or those structures and to make them more public so that people can say, oh, that's what we're doing, that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about whether we're thinking of reality as the one God or we're thinking about reality as multiple deities, all participating in the same reality. That makes a huge difference.
Yes. I feel like one world feels so small because 'cause I've been on both sides, you know what I mean? But yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and Priscilla, why you and why me? I mean,
Right,
to me, the real mystery is why some people are so open to considering other ideas and worldviews, and most people are not. So there's an answer there somewhere. There's a reason. I'm not
right.
saying I'm better or you're better than
No, not
those
at
others,
all.
but I'm saying we are different because
Yeah.
we're asking a set of questions that our families or cultures in which we were born are not asking.
Yes, or questions they wanted to ask, but were afraid to ask because of the, political and social implications.
And I will just add, I know we're out of time, but every religion that someone inhabits and thinks is the last word, it began as a very small, often persecuted tradition in another culture. And over centuries and millennia, it became dominant. And it only takes really 2 generations to think that this is the way the world has always been.
Mm.
And it's just not true.
Mhm.
It's just not true. The world changes, every well, maybe every second, but certainly every few decades.
Yes.
So
Yeah, and, do you have any closing thoughts on top of that? I'm sorry if I didn't get to all your questions. It's I don't like to keep guests too long because it's the weekend and all that stuff. Of course, we could talk to Jeff all day, but, he has a life outside of this world or this podcast. So, um, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything for people, any seekers out there, any advice to people just getting into this strange field of research or interesting?
no, I mean, my only piece of advice is try to think about that third space. It isn't just all about whether it can be debunked or not, or whether it can be believed or not. There might be this other option where something's really happening. It can't be explained away, but you also probably shouldn't believe everything. There is a nuanced kind of smart place in the middle that I think we should probably be trying to work toward. Um, so that would be my sort of parting thought, is that third space.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have any events coming up? We didn't even have time to get into the archives of the impossible and all that cool stuff. So,
Well,
do you have
just
anything coming?
no, but put the Archives of the Impossible link in the or wherever you put such things,
Yes.
because we've uploaded the entire conference.
Oh,
Any
great.
any of your listeners can listen to any of the plenaries. They can watch any of the panels.
And that's a YouTube, right? The
Yeah,
YouTube. Okay, because I
you know,
follow that and I was catching up on some of it because I couldn't watch it all.
it's all there. It's all there, and we're getting a lot of views and a lot of interest. And I think that's one way. Again, we can start to change the culture. Is just put stuff out.
Absolutely. I'll add that to the description, and I'll also put it in my link tree because there's a lot of amazing speakers there. And if you didn't get to watch any of it or just got to watch part of it, it's great to know that they're all up again. I want to say thank you to everybody listening again on either if you're listening to audio only on Anomalous Podcast Network, thank you so much. If you're watching this later, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, leave feedback. And there's other ways to support the channel in the description. And also, Jeff's website or his link to his Rice University website is in the description. And I will add the Archives of the Impossible to that description as well. Jeff, hang out for a second. And everybody, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your weekend or whenever you're listening to this. See you soon.